The massive lecture hall of the Galactic Union Academy buzzed with excited chatter. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy filled the tiered seats, their different shapes and colors creating a living rainbow. Some floated, others crawled, and a few even hung from special perches near the ceiling. In the front row, 3 humans sat quietly, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Professor Gray walked into the room, his 4 arms carrying different teaching tools. His silver skin reflected the bright lights of the hall as he set up his equipment. The professor was one of the few teachers who actually welcomed humans in his advanced xenobiology class. Most other professors still thought humans were too primitive to study at the galaxy's most prestigious school. "Quiet down, everyone," Professor Gray called out, his voice translator making his words clear to all species present. "Today's class will be different. Instead of just talking about how different species adapt, we're going to prove it with real experiments." The humans, Tom, Alice, and Mike, looked at each other. They had been the first humans ever accepted into the academy, arriving just 3 months ago. Most alien students still avoided them, whispering about Deathworlders behind their backs. "As you all know," Professor Gray continued, "every species evolves to match their home planet's conditions. Some of you come from worlds of eternal spring, others from planets where nothing ever changes." He paused, looking at the 3 humans. "And some come from worlds that our ancient scientists classified as death worlds." The room filled with nervous whispers. A floating bubble-like student near the humans actually moved away, its translucent body showing signs of stress. Professor Gray activated the main screen, showing a complex diagram. "For the next 7 days, we will conduct a series of experiments. Each of you will spend time in special chambers that simulate different planetary conditions. We will measure how well you adapt to changes." A student raised one of their tentacles. "Professor, isn't this dangerous? Some of us are very sensitive to environmental changes." "Don't worry," Professor Gray assured them. "The chambers have safety protocols. If anyone feels too uncomfortable, they can leave immediately." He smiled, all 3 rows of his teeth showing. "Besides, this is exactly what we want to study, why some species can handle changes better than others." Tom raised his hand. Unlike most humans, he was tall and thin, almost matching the height of the professor. "Will we be testing extreme conditions?" The alien students laughed. A crystal-based being in the back spoke up, its voice tinkling like wind chimes. "Afraid you can't handle it, Deathworlder." But Professor Gray's response silenced the laughter. "Actually, we will be using conditions that match average days on Earth for some tests." The room went completely quiet. Even the floating students seemed to freeze in midair. "Yes," Professor Gray continued, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Our chambers can safely recreate conditions from any known planet. Earth's daily weather changes will be particularly interesting to study." Alice, a former military cadet before joining the academy, couldn't help but smile. She remembered how shocked her alien roommate had been when learning about Earth's seasons, storms, and natural disasters. Mike, the most easygoing of the 3 humans, raised his hand next. "Professor, will we be graded on how well we adapt?" "No, Mr. Mike. This is purely for research. In fact, this experiment might help us understand why the Galactic Union's classification system labels some planets as death worlds, while others are considered paradise worlds." As Professor Gray explained more details about the experiment, the 3 humans noticed other students giving them worried looks. They had seen this before, the moment when aliens realized that humans lived on a planet that would kill most other species within minutes. The class ended with Professor Gray handing out permission forms. "Remember," he said, "this is voluntary. But those who participate will help us understand one of the greatest mysteries in xenobiology, how different species adapt to change." Walking out of the lecture hall, Tom, Alice, and Mike talked quietly among themselves. They knew this experiment would finally show everyone what humans could do. After all, they came from a planet where the weather could change hourly, where they had evolved to survive everything from freezing blizzards to burning deserts. Little did the alien students know, but they were about to learn why humans were considered the most adaptable species in the known galaxy. And it all started with a simple classroom experiment. The next morning, 20 students gathered in the Academy's testing facility. The huge room looked like something from a science fiction movie, filled with gleaming metal chambers arranged in a circle. Each chamber was the size of a small bedroom, with clear walls that could turn opaque at the touch of a button. Professor Gray stood in the center, checking readings on his tablet. "Welcome to day 1 of our adaptation experiment," he said, looking at the mixed group of volunteers. "These chambers are the most advanced environmental simulators in the galaxy." Tom, Alice, and Mike stood together near one of the chambers, examining its smooth surface. Other students kept their distance, forming small groups with their own kind. A cluster of light-based beings floated near the ceiling, their bodies pulsing with nervous energy. 3 rock-like students stood perfectly still, their crystalline bodies reflecting the room's lights. Each chamber can recreate any known planetary condition, Professor Gray explained. Temperature, pressure, gravity, atmospheric composition, everything can be adjusted. He walked to a control panel. "Today, we'll start with something simple. Temperature variation." A delicate-looking student with wings like colored glass raised a thin arm. "How much variation, Professor?" "We'll begin with a 10-degree change," Professor Gray answered. "The temperature will slowly rise and fall within safe limits." The alien students relaxed visibly. 10 degrees seemed perfectly safe to them. But the 3 humans exchanged knowing looks. They hadn't asked which temperature scale the professor was using. "Please enter your assigned chambers," Professor Gray instructed. "Each one has been calibrated for your species' basic needs. The safety systems will monitor your vital signs continuously." Mike walked into his chamber first, giving a thumbs up to his fellow humans. The gesture confused nearby alien students, who whispered among themselves about strange human body language. Tom and Alice followed, each entering their own chambers. The other students moved more cautiously. The light beings had to pass through special energy fields to enter their chambers. The rock-like students needed help from robotic assistants due to their weight. Once everyone was inside, Professor Gray's voice came through the speakers. "The experiment will last for 6 hours. Remember, you can exit at any time if you feel uncomfortable. We'll start with normal conditions for 5 minutes, then begin temperature variations." Tom sat on the comfortable chair in his chamber, watching as the clear walls turned slightly blue. The display panel showed the current temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, a perfect spring day on Earth. The first change began slowly. The temperature crept up to 25 degrees. Some of the alien students were already showing signs of discomfort. The light beings' glow flickered nervously, and the crystalline students' surfaces began to crackle softly. 30 degrees, announced the computer's calm voice. Through the still transparent walls, Tom could see the floating light beings growing dimmer. One of them pressed their emergency exit button, dissolving through their chamber's energy field in a panic. "This is no small change," shouted one of the remaining students, their voice trembling. "Our world never varies more than 2 degrees. The temperature continued rising. Alice had taken off her jacket, but looked perfectly comfortable. Mike had actually dozed off in his chamber, considering this nothing compared to summer afternoons back home. At 35 degrees, half of the alien students had left their chambers. The remaining ones watched in disbelief as the 3 humans showed no signs of distress. Then the temperature began dropping. Within minutes, it fell back to 20 degrees, then kept going down. The crystalline students started vibrating uncomfortably. Another one left their chamber when the temperature hit 10 degrees. Tom put his jacket back on, remembering winter mornings on Earth that were far colder than this. Alice was doing push-ups to stay warm, while Mike had finally woken up and was watching the other chambers with interest. By the time 3 hours had passed, only 5 students remained. The 3 humans, 1 crystalline being, and a single light entity who seemed determined to prove something. Professor Gray's voice came through again, filled with poorly hidden excitement. Fascinating results already. The human students are maintaining normal vital signs despite conditions that other species find intolerable. And we haven't even started the more extreme tests yet. The remaining alien students looked at the human chambers with new eyes. Perhaps there was more to these Deathworlders than they had thought. And this was only the beginning of the experiment. Professor Gray's excitement grew as he studied the data from the first trial. The remaining students had gathered in the observation room, watching screens filled with charts and numbers. Only 5 participants remained from the original 20, and the next test would be even more challenging. Your temperature adaptation results are remarkable, Professor Gray announced, all 4 of his arms moving as he gestured at different displays, especially you 3. He nodded toward Tom, Alice, and Mike. You maintained normal functions through temperature ranges that would be lethal on most worlds. The crystalline student who had survived the first trial made a sound like tinkling bells. But surely that was the worst of it. You said we would start simple. Professor Gray's silver skin rippled with what might have been amusement. Oh no, that was just to establish a baseline. Now we test something more interesting. Rapid temperature fluctuations combined with atmospheric moisture changes. Mike grinned. So, basically spring in the Midwest. The light being who had stayed through the first trial flickered nervously. What is a Midwest? A region on Earth, Alice explained, where you might need a winter coat in the morning and shorts by afternoon. Sometimes it rains, snows, and has tornadoes all in the same day. The alien students stared at her in horror. The crystalline being's surface actually cracked slightly from stress. Exactly, Professor Gray said. Today's test will simulate rapid weather changes. You'll experience everything from dry heat to humid cold, with minimal transition time. He checked his instruments. The chambers are ready. Please take your positions. As they walked to their chambers, Tom noticed something different. Small nozzles had appeared in the walls and ceiling. He suspected they weren't there just for show. Beginning sequence in 3, 2, 1. Professor Gray's voice came through the speakers. First condition. Dry heat, 40 degrees Celsius. The change was immediate. Hot, dry air filled the chambers. The crystalline student's surface began to fog up, while the light beam's glow pulsed erratically. Switching to humid heat in 10 seconds. Moisture filled the air. Tom felt sweat rolling down his face, but he stayed calm. This was nothing compared to summer training camps back on Earth. Through the chamber walls, he could see Alice doing stretches, apparently unbothered by the conditions. Mike had taken off his shirt and was using it as a towel. The crystalline student's surface was starting to show hairline cracks. This is impossible. No world should change this fast. Transitioning to cold and dry, Professor Gray announced. The temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the chamber walls. The light beings glow dimmed to almost nothing. And the crystalline student let out a high-pitched sound of distress. Adding moisture now. Snow began to fall inside the chambers. The crystalline student finally hit their emergency button, their crystalline body showing dangerous stress patterns. They stumbled out, leaving only the light being and the 3 humans. Mike was making snowballs. Alice had put her jacket back on but looked completely comfortable. Tom was taking notes on his tablet, treating the whole thing like a regular day. Fascinating. Professor Gray's voice was filled with wonder. The humans are not just tolerating these conditions, they're adapting to them instantly. Their core temperatures remain stable, their cognitive functions are unimpaired, and they're even engaging in recreational activities. The light being finally gave up when the chamber cycled back to humid heat. They dissolved through their chamber's energy field, their glow barely visible. Test concluded, Professor Gray announced. Only our human participants remain. Again. The 3 humans exited their chambers to find a crowd had gathered in the observation room. Students and teachers from other classes had come to watch the experiment. They stared at the humans with a mixture of fear and awe. I don't understand, one of the observing professors said. How can they function in conditions that would kill most species? Professor Gray looked at his data tablets with gleaming eyes. That's what makes this so exciting. These conditions, what we consider extreme, are actually normal on Earth. Their planet regularly experiences these changes, sometimes all in one day. You mean? A student in the crowd spoke up. They live like this all the time. Not exactly, Tom said with a small smile. These conditions are actually pretty mild compared to some Earth weather. The room fell silent. The aliens looked at each other nervously, finally beginning to understand why humans were classified as Deathworlders. And they hadn't even started the really challenging tests yet. Word spread quickly through the academy. By the time Professor Gray started the third day of experiments, the observation room was packed with spectators. Teachers canceled their classes, students skipped lectures, and even some academy officials came to watch. Everyone wanted to see the invincible humans in action. Today's test is about atmospheric pressure, Professor Gray announced, his silver skin gleaming under the bright lights. We'll simulate conditions from various planets, from the crushing pressure of gas giants to the near vacuum of small moons. The crowd murmured nervously. A few of the students who had quit earlier tests looked relieved they weren't participating anymore. We've reinforced the chambers, Professor Gray continued, and added extra safety measures. Though looking at the data from previous tests, our human friends might not need them. Tom, Alice, and Mike stood by their chambers, checking their suits. The academy had provided them with special pressure suits, but Professor Gray had said they would only need them for the most extreme tests. Beginning with standard Earth pressure, Professor Gray announced, then decreasing slowly. Inside his chamber, Tom watched the pressure gauge dropping. At first, it felt like climbing a mountain. He had done plenty of hiking back on Earth, so this was familiar. Through the chamber walls, he could see Alice doing breathing exercises, while Mike was playing a game on his tablet. Pressure now at 70% of Earth normal, the computer announced. The crowd of spectators pressed against the observation windows. Many of them had never seen beings function in such low pressure. On their worlds, such conditions would cause immediate health problems. 60% of Earth normal. Tom's ears popped. He yawned to equalize the pressure, remembering airplane flights back home. Alice had started doing push-ups, showing off for the crowd. Mike finally put his tablet down, looking slightly uncomfortable but still calm. 50% of Earth normal. Incredible, one of the academy officials whispered. They're barely affected. Our emergency teams would be treating severe cases of pressure sickness by now. Professor Gray nodded, his forearms dancing over the control panels. And remember, humans regularly climb mountains with even lower pressure. Some do it without oxygen supplies. That's impossible. Someone in the crowd shouted. No intelligent species would do that for fun. Increasing pressure now, Professor Gray announced. Going above Earth normal. The change was gradual but noticeable. Tom felt the increased pressure on his chest, but kept his breathing steady. He had trained in deep pools before. This wasn't too different. 150% of Earth normal. Alice had switched to doing squats, her military training showing. Mike had resumed his game, though he was sitting now instead of standing. Tom made notes on his tablet, recording how his body felt. 200% of Earth normal. The crowd was completely silent. According to their biology textbooks, most species would be unconscious or worse at this pressure. But the humans just looked mildly inconvenienced. Adding atmospheric composition changes, Professor Gray said, his voice excited. Increasing nitrogen levels, decreasing oxygen. Tom felt the change in air quality. It was like being at high altitude again. His breathing quickened slightly, but his mind stayed clear. Years of exposure to Earth's varying conditions had made his body adaptable. Their blood oxygen levels are dropping, one of the medical observers noted, but their bodies are compensating automatically. They're not even using their emergency oxygen supplies. Professor Gray's data screens filled with new information. Notice how their cells are adjusting to extract maximum oxygen from the thinner air. A survival mechanism developed on Earth, where oxygen levels have varied dramatically over millions of years. The test continued for another hour. The humans experienced pressures from both extremes, combined with different atmospheric mixtures. They never used their pressure suits or emergency systems. When they finally exited the chambers, the crowd backed away, creating a wide circle around them. The humans weren't just students anymore. They were living proof of something extraordinary. "I think," Professor Gray said, his voice carrying through the silent room, "we're beginning to understand why Earth is classified as a death world. It's not just about the dangerous creatures or extreme weather. It's about the beings who evolved there, beings whose bodies can adapt to conditions that would kill most species instantly." The three humans stood together, tired but proud. They had shown just a fraction of what humans could endure, and there were still more tests to come. The fourth day of experiments brought an unexpected change. Instead of heading to the testing chambers, Professor Gray led everyone to the Academy's largest lecture hall. The room was completely full. Students, teachers, and officials packed every available space. Even the Academy's head director was present, their crystalline form gleaming in the front row. "Before we continue with our experiments," Professor Gray announced, his silver skin rippling with excitement, "we need to understand something important. These tests have revealed more than just human adaptability. They've exposed a fundamental error in our understanding of what makes a planet hostile." The professor activated the main display, showing a beautiful blue and green planet, Earth. "This," he said, "is what we classified as a death world. We thought it was hostile because it has extreme conditions, but we were wrong." His four arms gestured at the display. "It's not a hostile planet. It's a planetary gymnasium." Tom, Alice, and Mike sat together, watching their alien classmates' reactions. The term gymnasium needed no translation. Every species understood the concept of training to become stronger. "Look at Earth's history," Professor Gray continued, showing graphs and charts. "In the last 100 years alone, humans have experienced global temperature changes, atmospheric pressure variations from sea level to mountain peaks, radiation from their sun, gravity changes from poles to equator, and regular natural disasters." The head director spoke up, their crystalline voice echoing through the hall. "Surely you're exaggerating. No species could evolve in such chaos." Mike raised his hand. "Actually, it's worse than that. Professor, show them our weather systems." Professor Gray nodded and changed the display. "Earth has these things called tornadoes, spinning columns of air that can lift buildings. They get hundreds of them every year. Then there are hurricanes, massive storms that can cover areas larger than some of your planets." The audience gasped. A group of light beings near the ceiling dimmed in shock. "But that's not all," Alice added. "We have earthquakes that shake entire continents, volcanoes that can block out the sun, and oceans that can create waves taller than this building." "Impossible," someone shouted. "You're making this up." Tom stood up. "Professor, may I?" When Professor Gray nodded, Tom walked to the display controls. "These are videos from my personal files, all recorded in the last year on Earth." The screen filled with footage. A tornado tearing through a city, a hurricane's eye wall, waves crashing over seawalls, lightning splitting the sky, blizzards burying towns in snow, and drought-cracked deserts. "By the galactic core," the head director whispered. "And you lived through these." "We don't just live through them," Alice explained. "We study them, chase them. Some humans make a living by following these events to learn more about them." Professor Gray took over again, his excitement barely contained. "Now you understand. The previous tests weren't challenging for humans because their entire planet is one continuous adaptation test. Every human is born into an environment that would kill most species, and they don't just survive, they thrive." He showed new data from the experiments. Their bodies can regulate temperature across huge ranges. They can process different atmospheric pressures instantly. They can adapt to radiation, gravity changes, and chemical variations in their environment. And most incredibly, they do this unconsciously. The room erupted in discussion. Some students were taking rapid notes, others were sending messages to their homeworlds, and a few looked like they might faint. "This changes everything," the head director announced. "Our classification system needs complete revision. If Earth is creating beings this adaptable just through natural conditions, then humans aren't just Deathworlders," Professor Gray finished. "They're the ultimate survival specialists. Their planet hasn't been trying to kill them. It's been training them. For millions of years, Earth has been producing beings capable of surviving almost anywhere in the galaxy." The three humans shared knowing looks. They had suspected this would happen. That sooner or later, the galaxy would realize why humans were different. It wasn't because they were stronger or smarter. It was because their home had never given them a choice. Adapt or die. As the room buzzed with excited discussion, Professor Gray made one final announcement. "And tomorrow, we'll prove it. The final tests will combine everything. All conditions at once. Then you'll see what real adaptation looks like." The crowd's excitement was palpable, but only the humans knew what was coming. After all, they called it just another day on Earth. The testing facility had been completely rebuilt overnight. The original chambers were replaced with 3 new ones, each twice the size and covered in warning signs in multiple languages. Emergency medical teams stood by, though everyone knew they were really there for the observers, not the human test subjects. "Today's test is unprecedented," Professor Gray announced to the packed observation room. "We will simulate multiple extreme conditions simultaneously. Temperature, pressure, gravity, radiation, atmospheric composition. Everything will change randomly." The head director stepped forward, their crystalline form catching the light. "Are you certain this is safe, even for them?" They gestured at Tom, Alice, and Mike, who were checking their backup equipment. "Actually," Mike said with a grin, "this sounds like spring break in Australia. Minus the wildlife, of course." The alien observers didn't laugh. They didn't know he wasn't joking. Professor Gray continued, "Each chamber has been programmed with a different combination of extreme conditions. We'll test the limits of human adaptation capabilities." Tom entered his chamber first, followed by Alice and Mike. The crowd pressed against the observation windows, many recording with their devices. This would be streamed live to every major scientific institution in the galaxy. "Beginning sequence," Professor Gray announced. "All conditions will change without warning. Emergency stops are in place," but he looked at his data screens. "Somehow I doubt we'll need them." The first change hit immediately. Gravity in Tom's chamber doubled, while the temperature dropped to freezing. In Alice's chamber, pressure increased to 3 times Earth normal as radiation levels spiked. Mike's chamber filled with thin, barely breathable air, while gravity reduced to Mars levels. "Vital signs are stable," one of the medical observers announced in shock. "They're adapting instantly to each change." The humans weren't just surviving. They were actively working. Tom had started doing push-ups in the double gravity, his body already adjusting to the weight. Alice was solving complex equations on her tablet, showing no signs of pressure stress. Mike was bouncing in the low gravity, treating it like a game. "Increasing difficulty," Professor Gray said, his silver skin almost glowing with excitement. The chambers turned into nightmare zones. Temperature swings of 50 degrees in seconds. Gravity shifting from triple Earth normal to near zero. Air pressure cycling between mountaintop thin to deep sea crushing. Radiation levels that would kill most species. Atmospheric composition changing from oxygen-rich to nearly unbreathable. But the humans kept going. "This is impossible," someone in the crowd shouted. "Their bodies should be shutting down." Professor Gray's data screens told a different story. "Look at these readings. Their bodies are adapting to each change before it even fully occurs. They're anticipating the shifts. He was right. The humans had started predicting the patterns. When gravity increased, they were already adjusting their stance. Before temperature drops, they were tensing the right muscles. Their bodies, trained by Earth's constant changes, were acting on instinct. 2 hours in, Professor Gray announced, activating maximum variables. All 3 chambers turned into swirling chaos. Conditions changed every few seconds, combining in ways that should have been lethal. The emergency medical teams gripped their equipment, certain they would be needed. But inside the chambers, something extraordinary was happening. Tom had started doing his stenobiology homework, seemingly unbothered by the crushing gravity and freezing temperature. Alice was practicing martial arts forms, her movements smooth despite the pressure changes. Mike had actually fallen asleep, his body automatically adjusting to each new condition. 3 hours, Professor Gray said softly. They're not just surviving. They're ignoring conditions that would kill any other known species instantly. The head director's crystalline surface showed waves of color, a sign of deep emotional impact. Stop the test. We've seen enough. As the chambers returned to normal conditions, the humans emerged looking only mildly tired. Tom stretched like he'd just had a light workout. Alice checked her fitness tracker, disappointed it hadn't been more challenging. Mike yawned and asked if anyone wanted to get lunch. The observation room was dead silent. Every alien being present had just witnessed something that changed their understanding of life itself. They had classified humans as Deathworlders, thinking it was a limitation. Now they realized it was the opposite. It wasn't just that humans could survive anywhere. They could live, work, think, and even sleep in conditions that would kill most species in seconds. Earth hadn't just made them strong, it had made them nearly invincible. And this was just the beginning of what humans could do. 1 week after the experiments ended, the Grand Hall of the Galactic Union's Science Council was filled to capacity. Beings from 1,000 worlds had gathered to hear Professor Gray's presentation. The results of his simple classroom experiment had shaken the foundations of xenobiology. Tom, Alice, and Mike sat in the front row, wearing their academy uniforms. They looked almost ordinary among the exotic alien species around them, until you knew what they could do. Professor Gray stood at the center of the hall, his silver skin reflecting the spotlight. Behind him, massive screens showed data from the experiments. Distinguished members of the council, he began, what started as a simple classroom experiment has led to the most significant discovery in xenobiology in the last century. We must completely revise our understanding of what makes a species advanced. The screens showed footage from the experiments. Humans functioning normally in conditions that would kill most species instantly. For generations, we believed that advanced worlds were stable, unchanging, perfect. Professor Gray continued. We classified Earth as a death world because it was chaotic, dangerous, and unpredictable. We were wrong. He brought up a new image. Earth, with all its weather systems, tectonic activity, and natural phenomena marked in bright colors. Earth isn't a death world. It's nature's greatest training program. Every challenge, every disaster, every extreme condition has been shaping its inhabitants for millions of years. The result? He gestured to the 3 humans, beings who can survive anywhere. The council members murmured among themselves. A representative from a gas giant world raised their energy tendril. Are you suggesting we change the classification system? I'm suggesting more than that, Professor Gray replied. We need to change how we think about survival itself. These experiments prove that humans don't just endure extreme conditions, they adapt to them instantly, unconsciously, and permanently. He showed new data, brain scans, cellular analysis, genetic studies. Their bodies don't just resist change, they embrace it. Every new challenge makes them stronger. Every extreme condition teaches them something new. Mike raised his hand, and surprisingly, the council head nodded for him to speak. Back home, we have a saying, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." We didn't realize how literally true that was. Tom stood up next. We thought we were just being tough. But now we understand. Earth trained us to be universal survivors. Every thunderstorm, every earthquake, every climate shift was a lesson. Alice added, "And we're still learning, still adapting, still getting stronger." The council chamber erupted in discussion. Some members looked frightened, others fascinated. The head director of the academy, who had flown in specially for this presentation, stepped forward. Based on these findings, they announced, their crystalline voice ringing through the hall, the academy is creating a new department, adaptive biology, and we're offering full scholarships to any human who wants to study there. Professor Gray nodded excitedly. Yes, because we've only scratched the surface. These experiments tested physical adaptation, but humans showed the same flexibility in their minds, their societies, their technologies. They don't just survive change, they create it. He showed one final set of images, humans living on space stations, exploring ocean depths, climbing mountains, surviving in deserts, and thriving in the most extreme environments. The galaxy has been asking the wrong question, Professor Gray concluded. We shouldn't ask how humans survive on a death world. We should ask what they'll be capable of now that they have the whole galaxy to adapt to. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Humans weren't just another species joining the galactic community. They were the ultimate survivors, shaped by the most demanding planet known to science. Tom, Alice, and Mike stood together, feeling the weight of the moment. Their simple classroom experiment had changed everything. Earth was no longer seen as a backward, dangerous world. It was now recognized as the forge where nature had created its masterpiece, a species that could face any challenge, survive any condition, and adapt to any situation. As they left the council chamber that day, they heard aliens whispering a new phrase, "Tough as a human." It wasn't an insult anymore. It was the highest praise possible. And somewhere on Earth, a storm was brewing, a volcano was rumbling, and the planet continued its work, training the next generation of the galaxy's most adaptable species.